Thank you very much. It's very nice to pay a return visit, actually, to this organisation. The last time I came, we were talking about referendums and treaties and the reasons for Ireland to vote yes to a European future. Someone who believes strongly, as the chairman said, in that European future, I'm only grateful that Ireland doesn't have to have a referendum on Europe now in relation to the current crisis. Of course, we should all start from the basis, I think, that Ireland has had a great deal of support from the EU, especially the liquidity funding that the banks have received from the European Central Bank. But it's also true that you're taking heavy punishment for the so-called bailout by the EU and the IMF. Now, there are some in Brussels and some other European capitals who say you deserve it, given the folly of the Irish government in guaranteeing its banks in the way that it did, despite the fact that some of them were incontinent, and one of them was worse than that, probably criminal. Ship of Fools by Fintan O'Toole has got an avid readership in Brussels. And vivid read it proved for me as well. Of course, it's not just Ireland in crisis, it's affecting everybody in the EU, even if the extent varies. The crisis has had two phases so far. The first was the banking crisis, which smashed into Ireland and the UK, and some others particularly. Collapse of Lehman Brothers triggered this unwillingness of banks to lend to each other, which exposed the weaknesses in the more reckless, and exposed to this murky world of derivatives, tax havens, dedicated to what Warren Buffett, no less, has described as alchemy, turning base metal into gold. A world that was unstable, and as Adair Turner, Lord Turner, well connected with Ireland, by the way, and he has described it, now chairman of the the Regulatory Authority in London, has described as socially useless what this industry was doing. And what American, British and Irish governments had regarded as strengths in the growth of their very rich financial services industries were turned into weapons of mass destruction, inflicting huge losses on nations as things went wrong. It sent Ireland immediately into austerity, and that was 2 or more years ago, and this year other countries are going to follow that same path. Why perhaps only now will others follow the same path? After all the countries stood behind their banks. They had to, after Ireland did, by the way, because of the capital flows all came here in a weekend, and you'd have owed a phenomenal amount to virtually just about every speculator in the world. They all took the bad debts of the banks onto the public balance sheet. And additionally, many countries took counter-cyclical action in the classic Keynesian way during 2008-2009. Car scrappage schemes, the subsidised short-time working schemes, cuts in VAT, maintaining public spending despite precipitate falls in tax revenues, devaluation of the currency if you were not in the euro. These were the stimuli packages, and some of these are now ending. And they're ending because the bank crisis became a sovereign debt crisis following the admission by the newly elected Greek government that its predecessor had been cheating on the rules of the euro, and that the Greek economy was in a much worse state than had previously been admitted, and in a very different way than the Irish position, by the way. But the thing had been covered up by the previous government, aided and abetted, incidentally, lest we forget, by Goldman Sachs and by Deutsche Bank. From that moment on, market attention switched away from the banks and started to focus on the strengths and weaknesses of every EU economy. Ireland, whose austerity programme had been hailed as a model for others in trouble by the European Commission, was next in line after Greece, and it showed the original so-called model plan wasn't enough. More austerity was required. That was not enough. And when Ireland had to go to the EFSF, the European Financial Stability Facility, more austerity again was required. And the Economist said this week in the latest issue, at some point it will be politically impossible to demand more austerity. But that is what is being envisaged in the new rules on economic governance, which were agreed at the EU summit in December and discussed, I think, yesterday at the meeting of finance ministers at which Brian Lenihan was present. And the new rules are being put together in what's called the new European semester by the Commission, which was issued last week by the Commission, and will provide some kind of overall framework for this particular exercise in economic governance. Incidentally, the term semester was invented to get round a contradiction, namely the need to respect the power of national parliaments, which vote through member states' budgets, but also to ensure that those budgets respect the Eurozone Stability Pact. And this is the next phase, and this is for everybody, not just countries in difficulty, that the parliamentary autonomy is going to have to be reconciled with European commitments. And there's a 6-month preparatory period during which time the Eurozone countries and the other member states who are not in the Euro but who will be affected in a different way, but they will discuss at EU level the budget decisions for each for the year to come, ahead of decisions being made by the national parliaments towards the end of the year, usually during the autumn period. All that work is done. So the Commission is busily organising the technicalities and various stages of this preparatory period and has just been publishing the details. Now, it won't be easy to coordinate the budget policies of countries whose economic situations, political cultures vary so widely. Most will have to cut deficits, which in all cases, I mean, at the moment, is only Sweden and Estonia in line with the Stability and Growth Pact. And Estonia has only just joined the Euro and Sweden's not in it. So nobody actually is complying with these rules at the present time. So I've got a certain disconnect with reality, what they're doing at the present time. But under German pressure, the pressure being, if we're to provide money for things, it's going to be a tough rules regime. This is the way the exercise has been going. And so most will be having to cut their deficits. They can't adjust the value of the currency. And by the way, just to take a word on the British situation, who've been urging, I see some of the Eurosceptics been urging Ireland leave the Euro, get out of it, and so on. But I think it's not a feasible position because the debt still has to be paid back in euros. And presumably, if you were not in the Eurozone, without any assistance from EU sources. So that's one issue that people in Ireland need to always have in mind when there's these siren voices from the other side of the Irish Sea pop across from time to time. And also looming on the horizon, and a worrying thing for Ireland in particular, but others as well, is that in the spring of this year, the banks will be sitting tougher stress tests. And this might result in them having to restructure or increase their levels of capital. So you can see the Irish banks passed, amazingly, the stress tests that were done last time. So did the British banks. And of course, the effect of somebody saying you failed to a bank would be disastrous. But can one or two of the Irish banks make it through these particular tests if the tests are to be credible in the future? And so in these ways, the processes of economic governance are motoring on. In January, the Commission, later this month, will unveil the EU's economic priorities. They will be assessed in March. Decisions will be taken then by the European Council. followed by each member state having to explain how it will introduce EU guidelines into its own stability and convergence programme. In June and July, the national programmes will be discussed in common, endorsed, and then they go to the national parliaments, and so on. The timetable, I think Brian Lenihan was arguing against yesterday, and so on. But he didn't get much support for any relaxation of this. Ireland already knows about economic governance. Others are about to find out. And in the Irish case, we can see that there are major challenges to the social partners who just arrived in time to hear what those challenges that they face. As I'm retiring shortly, I can say these things with a degree of relaxation. What we in the ETUC can't accept is detailed intervention in the labour market by the EU-IMF team. I complained last week about EU officials operating in Ireland like they were the Governor-General, or as someone termed it, the Grand Vizier of a quasi-colonial administration. This has provoked some strong objections from, amongst others, the President of the Commission, and from Business Europe, of which IBEC are important members. And I'll be meeting Commissioner Wren next Monday to discuss my complaints on behalf of European TUC and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions and also the Greek affiliates. But particular exception was taken to my remarks about inflicting rules on the country which are more in the spirit of the Versailles Treaty, remember, which crippled Germany after the First World War in reparation payments, than the Marshall Plan, which so benefited Western Europe after the Second World War. One was punitive, the other was generous. And what Europe needs at the moment is some spirit of generosity to help the hard-hit countries, not the kind of penalty regimes, punishment squads, which are being imposed at the present time. For us, the EU has not set the balance right, and we cannot support the current proposals on economic governance. They're unbalanced towards austerity and punishment, with not enough emphasis on growth. Thus, there's no mention of financial transaction taxes, which we're strongly in favour of, taking a slice off each deal that's done in London, Dublin, and the other financial centres of Europe. No commitment on Eurobonds, where Europe itself could raise money and take some of the pressure off hard-hit member states. Now, what does all this mean for Europe? Obviously, there is a need for decisive action to protect the euro, and in my case, I like to confound all those British Eurosceptics who are celebrating that Britain is not in the euro at the present time. In fact, bizarrely, celebrating they are a 20% devaluation of sterling against the euro, which has made the UK 20% poorer than it was before that devaluation. But I guess it is a fact, and I've got to recognise this, that devaluation, particularly in a period of recession, doesn't seem to have made people feel much poorer. And for Ireland, where devaluation is not an option, the effects of austerity are probably of the same order, not very dissimilar anyway, but the method is more painful than devaluation at the moment, although if the upward trend in inflation is maintained, the British position will not be so painless as some of my compatriots think it might be. For the ETUC, we are committed to continue to campaign against austerity and to angle the policies more towards jobs and growth through issues like Eurobonds and financial transaction taxes. For economic governance that is growth-oriented, not trying to create some Dickensian Dotheboys Hall environment of strict controls on the pupils of Europe in the way that seems to be being envisaged. We're for social partnership that can do the necessary heavy lifting when a country is in trouble, and some countries are able to do that, and I believe that given a fair wind, Ireland would make a pretty good job of it, despite the seriousness of the present situation. And we, for measures in which everybody contributes their fair shares to national recovery, the rich as well as those on minimum wages and benefits. And I look forward very much to the Irish rich, who benefited so much in the boom, paying their fair share in the period ahead. Or will they threaten, like the London bankers and hedge fund managers of Mayfair, that they'll emigrate if they have to take normal deals on pay and pay normal taxes? This is a very worrying development, this apparent readiness of the rich and powerful to emigrate at the first whiff of any threat to the way they operate. I don't recall previous crises that have produced this kind of reaction. Often the United States produces glimpses of what our future might be. I was struck by an article in the New York Times last week which concluded that politically now in the United States there is no possibility of any increases in taxation on the American rich, despite the fact, as you're probably reading daily in the papers, California, one of the richest parts of the world, can't pay its firemen, policemen, hospitals, schools, closing, and so on. There's no possibility of any increases in taxation on the rich because a combination of powerful lobbyists, the Fox-type media forever banging on against government and against politicians and democracy, and the politicians' own dependence upon the rich for campaign funding mean that they are untouchable by American democracy. The author went on to say that this is government for the rich, by the rich, in effect, a plutocracy. And if it rings true to you about aspects of life in Ireland, it rings true to me certainly about aspects of life in the UK. And if plutocracy is replacing democracy, what this means for the rest of us. Now, this is not comfortable territory for a moderate trade union leader, distinguished, or about to become a distinguished member of the House of Lords, and so on. It's now, I'll just finish my notes with, now, which is the way to that General Post Office? Because that's the kind of feelings that are around. That's a joke, by the way, for the press here. I'm not advocating that. But the sense that, that we are, with democracy in difficulty, not least after the events in the Dáil yesterday and probably going on today, but in other countries too, with democracy at a low ebb, can we build the kind of national unity and national commitment that's necessary to make these changes? That's going to be a challenge for the trade union movement and Democrats across Europe, and not just in Europe, but in countries like the United States as well. So, Chairman, some remarks on European solidarity in the period ahead, and raising some alarms about this system of economic governance, because I don't think the people of Europe know what's in for them under these rules where national budgets have to be cleared in advance, in effect, by the European Union. And the penalties, if you don't do that, are going to be rather severe. Thank you.
Thank you.